Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Jajuan Johnson, and it's a pleasure to see you. And welcome to our afternoon seminar and symposium. Before we get started, I want to read our land acknowledgement. William and Mary acknowledges the indigenous peoples who are the original inhabitants of the land our campus is on today. The Cheronhaka, Nottoway, Chickahominy, Eastern Chickahominy, Mattaponi, Monacan, Nansemond, Nottoway, um, Pamunkey, Potomac, Upper Mattaponi, and Rappahannock tribes. And we pay our respects to the tribal members, past and present. I'm delighted to have two wonderful panelists with us this afternoon, Mr. Jackson Cantrell and Dr. Charles McLeod. Before we get started, I'm just going to read their bios, and then we'll return back to our first presenter, Mr. Cantrell. Jackson Cantrell is a high school senior from Manville, Louisiana. He is a National Merit Finalist, State Eagle Scout of the Year, and Congressional Representative for Louisiana's Legislative Youth Advisory Council. As a preservation advocate, he has submitted formal testimony regarding the protection of public lands. Jackson researched the lives of local enslaved and indigenous groups as content for historical markers and the aim of his Eagle Scout service project. He is president of Manville's Youth and Government Club. He also facilitates Model UN conferences and respectful debate. Servant leadership and advocacy are his callings. Dr. Charles McLeod is an educational consultant and motivational speaker. Among his many accomplishments, he was the first African American to play on the basketball team for Virginia Commonwealth University, where he earned a BS in sociology and a Master's of Arts in counselor education. He would go on to earn a doctorate in higher education administration at the University of Virginia. Dr. McLeod's professional experiences include faculty and administrative positions spanning elementary, middle school, high school, and higher education. He has served as an assistant supervisor at the State Department of Education. Dr. McLeod and his wife live in the Richmond, Virginia area, where they raised two Harvard-educated sons. Again, thank you all for joining us. We're going to start with Mr. Cantrell.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson. Bear with me for a second. I'm still attempting to figure out Zoom. I'm more than a little incompetent when it comes to this, so bear with me. Can everybody hear me all right? Excellent. All right. Thank you very much. So hello, everyone. Before we get started, there are a couple of items I'd like to address. First, there aren't any pictures on record of the enslaved family members from the Fontainebleau plantation. I have included, however, images of other individuals who lived during the same time period. These individuals are not substitutes or stand-ins, but the people in these images experienced parallel situations. Secondly, many of you are historians who are likely familiar with the institution of slavery, but for others, please let me warn you that much of what I'm going to discuss here with you is disturbing, but it needs to be brought forward and addressed. In understanding history, it's important to consider key events of the time period in which one is addressing, in this case, 1800s New Orleans. The enslaved were impacted by building booms, catastrophes, legislative changes, and financial fluctuations. From discussing history, we'll move on to the families and especially the women of Fontainebleau. I do thank you all for your interest in these individuals whose stories before 2019 were unknown. The families lived from 1829 to 1862 at a place that was unlike others of the time. If you will, please look for the two stars at the top of the map. Fontainebleau is in red and is today a state park. The blue star next to it is my hometown of Mandeville. But back in the 1800s, a visit from New Orleans would take about 2.5 hours by steamship. This 1848 map by La Tourette shows that most plantations were clustered along the Mississippi River. They were strategically located for shipping indigo, sugar, rice, and cotton. Fontainebleau was built in 1829 in a comparatively very unusual spot. The property's founder also had three much older plantations down on the Mississippi River. One was right next to New Orleans, but others were further downstream. These sites may have been from which some of the enslaved individuals at Fontainebleau may have originally come from. Last of all, if you would, notice the blue dashed line showing the canal connecting New Orleans with the lake. Constructed by the enslaved, it was vital for transportation and for shipping. And in the mid-1850s, it was converted into a railroad line. One of its first passengers was a young Abraham Lincoln. Excuse me. From this close-up, I'd like to ask you to remember the canal for later. And the man who owned it and all of these starred properties was Bernard de Marigny de Mandeville. And if you've ever visited New Orleans, you might have been to dinner in a part of town called the Faubourg Marigny. This area, shown in yellow, was originally his family plantation. Bernard inherited it when he was 15 with the death of his father. And in 1805, he was a 20-year-old who had the novel idea to subdivide his land into housing lots. Already one of the wealthiest young men in North America, made an absolute fortune with this real estate deal. The success of this housing boom is what led to certain enslaved families being uprooted and moved to Fontainebleau forcibly. But the question remains, why? Well, Bernard went to look for other land to subdivide, but this time he turned to the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain. In 1829, Bernard bought an enormous cattle ranch, which he named Fontainebleau. It is shown in red. He also started buying additional land surrounding the plantation to subdivide, and within 5 years, it would be called the town of Mandeville, named after his family. Now, as everybody knows, the three most important things in real estate are location, location, and location. But the fourth, which is lesser known, is timing. While Bernard was preparing to sell his North Shore lots, a horrific and absolutely catastrophic cholera pandemic reached North America. Within the first 10 days of the outbreak in New Orleans, 1 person out of every 10 was dead. Enslaved, the free people of color, and the whites were dying in droves. Cemeteries could not keep up with the influx, and canals that were being excavated for drainage suddenly fulfilled the role of mass graves. As you can imagine, New Orleanians were desperate to get away from the outbreak. And on New Year's Day of 1834, the local newspaper advertised that Bernard's housing lots on the North Shore would be coming up for sale. When sales opened in February, Bernard made today's equivalent of $3 million in just the first 3 days. And that was only in property sales. Because he had Fontainebleau nearby, he could also offer his clients one-stop shopping. He had bricks and lumber, and he had the Black Hawk, a steamship which could transport clients back and forth in style. He had the Foray, his schooner, which could deliver their furnishings, cases of wine, and any imported goods which they desired. If you'll remember the Blue Canal. Bernard also had an incredibly talented group of artisans and masons, carpenters, and engineers. They could build beautiful, sturdy homes quickly, complete with lush, blooming gardens. Those talented workers were, of course, the enslaved people of Fontainebleau. In sum, Mandeville and Fontainebleau were an interconnected investment. And while it's true that sugar refining did eventually go on, the industrial park, enslaved labor, and real estate were really where the profits were. And for good reason too, the beauty of the North Shore appealed to many. Today, Fontainebleau is a state park that covers 2,800 acres, about half the size when Bernard owned it. Most of the land was used for a hunting retreat. Bernard still lived in New Orleans, but used Fontainebleau as a getaway and a place to entertain friends. He installed his youngest son, the 23-year-old Armand, to run the property, but it was primarily the talented enslaved men who operated it. Other than Armand, only 2 free men were on site. The enslaved, however, numbered 153. And so, in this place of wild, rugged, and sustained beauty, we turn to the ugliness of slavery. Using 2 superimposed archaeology surveys, we can see old brick building foundations marked on this satellite map. The red buildings on the far right were part of the industrial complex. The other red buildings included a blacksmith shop, wine cellar, hospital, 2 kitchens, a pigeonnier to raise squab, 2 ranch houses for the Maroney family and guests, and other work centers. The blue blocks, aligned in rows, were the slave quarters. This is all that remains today. In its heyday, this factory was a technological marvel, a state-of-the-art industrial park like no other in the South. Letters and books at the time also mention how unusual it was that Maroney steam engineers was operating the single most critical piece of this system were enslaved men. Other than the industrial center, Fontainebleau was constantly busy. Records mention stables, smokehouses, mule barns, and sheds for the oxen. There were feedlots for sheep and cattle and pigs. Clay had to be dug for the bricks. Trees had to be felled for lumber. Sugarcane fields, orchards, sweet potato crops, and livestock all had to be tended. Gardens, a turtle pen, and chicken coops, too, needed attention. Cooking, mending, childcare, and cleaning went on all day, and when at last the workday was finally done, it was under this alley of oaks that they slept. The slave quarters, 20 double cabins, and a pair of singles were long ago destroyed, but the oak trees that were planted to shade them still remain. While I cannot show you their quarters specifically, I can, however, show you this. This is Evergreen Plantation, about 45 minutes west of New Orleans. Great tour, by the way. These original slave quarters are still intact and are nearly identical to Fontainebleau's cabins. Again, these are not substitutes or stand-ins, but enslaved families lived here too. So the question still remains, who was it that lived in Fontainebleau's quarters? My first attempt in trying to find that answer ended up telling me instead who was not there. Allow me to elaborate. Records called slave schedules have columns for the gender, age, and race of the people present. There are no names. At Fontainebleau, I noticed that of the men and boys listed, 11% of them were called mulatto or mixed. By contrast, there was only one young woman and her baby listed in that way. This could be interpreted as just a demographic anomaly, but lighter-skinned girls were regularly forced into human trafficking. They were called fancy girls. These young sisters, Mary and Emily Edmondson, were forced into the fancy trade until their relatives were able to pool enough money to free them. For whatever reason, women of lighter complexion were missing from Fontainebleau. The next step to discover these people was to check census records. A census lists everybody living on site, not just the enslaved. And because translating handwritten documents can be tricky, this 1840 census was accidentally filed under the wrong name. And for decades, it was missing until I stumbled onto it simply by chance, really. Today's state park officials had never seen this census, and they had no idea that 153 people were held in bondage here, let alone the number of children. In 1840, 57 children under the age of 10 were living on site. In Louisiana, an enslaved child's 10th birthday was a major occasion. From that point on, he or she could be sold away from their mother, but in other states, that age was 5. This census had other new information. Bernard's son Armand took the trouble to list 3 sets of very skilled workers: the sugar makers, brick makers, and navigators. When I saw 10 men listed as navigators, sailors, I was fascinated. I had already known about the delivery schooner Foray, and it sailed Fontainebleau's products across the lake, then down to the docks of the Mississippi. Again, remember that Blue Canal, and brought supplies back. North Shore businesses paid also to have their products shipped on the Foray. And when people wanted supplies from the city, the Foray too would bring it all back. The boat was constantly sailing back and forth. It had never occurred to me, though, that the Foray's 10-man crew sailing free for 30 years were enslaved men. I later dug into sales records from 1852, and sure enough, the enslaved crew showed up again. I was 16 when I made this discovery, and my imagination was in high gear. Why, I wondered, why didn't they ever take the ship and make a run for it? I am of the opinion that they stayed for their families. And here are those family members, shown by name. This image is a close-up of the 1841 mortgage on Fontainebleau. It's one of 6 taken out between 1837 and 1852. When a business owner came into hard times financially, he didn't just take out loans on land. He took them out on his most valuable asset, the enslaved. Banks insisted on each person being listed by name and age. In the slave schedules and census, remember, nobody was identified by name, but for a bank and its investors, names meant money. Let's take a look at one of the mortgages. Should they foreclose, banks needed to distinguish who was who. Otherwise, the landowner could switch out a 30-year-old pastry chef or chemist for a 30-year-old failed hand, somebody who, comparatively, would bring far less at the auction block. Children were shown by name and age too, and here you can see that 3-year-old Israel and 2-year-old Lisa were put up as collateral along with adults. Banks preferred to mortgage valuable adults along with people they saw as having less worth. To investors, a group of enslaved people functioned like a mutual fund. Should one super valuable asset die or be maimed, the losses could be averaged down. To investigate slavery, unfortunately, one has to follow the money. Now, in all 6 mortgages here and at Bernard's other plantations, I noticed that every now and then a person would be listed with a last name. Because I didn't speak French, it took me months to figure out that Ned Cordonnier was a shoemaker, that Sam Pentray was a faux painter, and that the men Valerie Golette and Ned Golette were not, in fact, brothers. Golette is the French word for schooner, and Valerie and Ned, they were the ship's pilots. What this showed was that only people with especially rare skills, and therefore very high monetary value, are given last names on the Fontainebleau mortgages. But what about the women of Fontainebleau? Let's consider in this instance Frosine, whose name is underlined in red. Frosine was a 40-year-old mom. Her boys were Zeal and Charles. They were both aged 12 and 16 respectively. Her little girl Agnes was 5, and her 6-month-old baby was not yet recorded by name. They are all listed as specie or collateral on the loan. Some of the early mortgages I saw had children listed separately from adults, but when I saw this record showing kids with their moms, it helped me imagine the families more clearly and the lines that they followed. It turns out that banks wanted the women to be listed with their children to prove that they could reproduce. And because when in 1808 it became illegal to purchase enslaved people from overseas, a woman's ability to have babies made them more valuable. What kind of work did Frosine do? Well, there were endless tasks, but during sugar harvest, it was all hands on deck, so to speak, to bring in the crop and to refine it. Frosine would likely have had to help cut cane in the fields. And the refining process begins when stalks of cane are fed into the presses. Fontainebleau had 2 sugar presses operated by its massive steam engine. To quote a refinery worker, if a mill feeder be catched by the finger, his whole body is drawn in and squeezed to pieces. It is no wonder that a small hospital was on site. But who were the ones that fed the sugar stalks into the feeder? Many were children. They were the ideal size to get in amongst the machinery. Their little hands and arms were perfect for the job. Let's go back now to the 1841 mortgage. I'd like to talk now about 2 unique women named Amy Kentucky and Lucille American. As you'll notice, both were listed with last names. These women, 30 and 28 at the time, were incredibly valuable because they spoke English. I am of the opinion that they had important roles to play. More than others, Bernard Maroney, Fontainebleau's owner, especially knew their value. After Louisiana became a part of the United States, its free and enslaved inhabitants still spoke primarily French for decades longer. And when Americans began to take over the state Supreme Court, they tried to nullify every family will written in French, not English. That meant that whatever one's inheritance might be gotten from one's parents would be seized by the state, unless the will was in English. Louisiana citizens were horrified. A state senator wrote legislation in order to counteract these attempts called the French Bill and stop these acts. But it became clear the English language would overtake Louisiana. That same state senator who wrote this French bill was none other than Bernard Marigny. He knew that if his workforce of 153 individuals became bilingual, their value would skyrocket. Amy and Lucille were a way to make that happen. Another woman who lived at Fontainebleau was Selina St. Pé. She was a free woman of color who was married to Armand Marigny. Selina was the only free woman on site, and it is possible that she may have spent time with the enslaved women. Was she kind to them or harsh, ambivalent? Did she influence her husband's treatment of them? We don't know. What I can report is that when Hurricane Katrina damaged the park, heavy equipment was brought in for cleanup. When the treads sunk into the soil, the hearths of the slave cabins were revealed, and in each, shards of fine bone china were discovered. Since her finicky father-in-law, Bernard, may not have tolerated chipped plates at his dinner table, it is possible that Selina gave them to the other women. Did she? No one knows for sure. There's a second free woman of color who was also a big part of Bernard de Marigny de Mandeville's family. Eulalie was his older sister. Her mother, Jeanette, an enslaved woman from the Congo, when Jeanette gave birth, her baby girl, by law, was a slave. The Mandeville family granted them their freedom when Eulalie was 5. She was raised by her Mandeville grandmother, but where her mother, Jeanette, went, I don't know for certain. Beautifully dressed, well-educated, and with impeccable manners, Eulalie was every bit a lady. She was 20 and Bernard was 15 when their father died. She inherited acreage, cattle, cash, and enslaved individuals. Brother and sister were close. They were in their 20s when Bernard created the Faubourg Marigny, gave her housing lots, and later shipped her bricks and timber. This is one of Eulalie's real estate flyers. She built rental houses too and had dairy businesses and mercantile stores all over the city. Eulalie, born into slavery, became a millionaire. The last women I'll mention are the two who mean the most to me. Violette and Bonine arrived at Fontainebleau as toddlers. They were mortgaged 6 times over the years, and every time I saw them listed as collateral, they grew a little bit older to me. When I discovered the mortgage that we've been looking at today, they were teenagers, just like me at the time. And when Fontainebleau was finally sold in 1852, the girls had grown into young mothers in their mid-20s, toddlers to teenagers to moms. I know that they were purchased with the property, but I have no idea if they stayed on site. I don't know either whether their 5 children were later sold off from them. I lost them to time and to history, unfortunately. When I installed this marker in June 2019, there wasn't room on the sign to possibly list all 153 names, but I did include those of Violette and Bonine. I wanted to show my respect to them, to tell the world that they were not forgotten. I wanted to the best of my ability, help them and their counterparts rest in peace. In closing, I understand that slavery is an uncomfortable topic to discuss, to say the least. But it is important to remember all our history, because if we don't, mistakes made in the past may just come back to haunt us in the future. When finances become more important than humanity, and when the norms of today's world lead us on a dark path, it is these stories from our past that can remind us of what is right. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon. Am I on?
Yes.
Waiting for Dr. Johnson.
Yes.
Good afternoon, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to share a few glimpses into the life of Nellie Jane Hinderman McLeod, my mother. I've got a lot of information to share with you, and I'll try to do it within the 20-minute time frame I've been allotted. First of all, I want to thank the Lemon Project for giving me this platform to speak from. And I want to thank each of you who have tuned in to hear what I have to say. I'm going to talk initially in part one about my mother's role in the civil rights movement. And then part two, I'm going to share with you a few personal experiences I had with her, not in her public persona, but as a mother, as a parent. So let me begin. Nellie Jane Hinderman McLeod was born on November 8, 1926 in Beeville, Texas, a small southeast town located about 1 hour west of Corpus Christi. The daughter of Lovis and Ida Hinderman, Nellie was the seventh of 8 children, 4 sisters, Mary Alice, Cecilia Beatrice, Ida Louise, Gaola Bernadette, and 3 brothers, Lovis August, Harold Thompson, and Calvin Eugene. At the tender age of 6, Nellie lost her mother due to childbirth complications. Tragically, Nellie lost her father at the age of 15 when he took his own life as a result of horrendous injuries he suffered from a gas explosion at his Beeville restaurant, which took the life of his partner, Mr. Lytle. At the age of 17, Nellie was a single teen mom with 2 boys, Harold and Joseph. Despite these challenges early in life, Nellie went on to triumph over adversity and lived a life so brave and courageous, it was chronicled in the Library of Congress. On September 7, 1945, Nellie's life began to improve when she married William Bill Charles McLeod, a young sailor from Dothan, Alabama, who was stationed at nearby Beeville Naval Airfield. Together, they had 5 children: Priscilla, Charles, both born in Texas in Beeville, and daughters Sheila, Yolanda, and Kimberly, each born in Virginia. In 1951, the family moved from Texas to Hopewell, Virginia, and lived in what was called the Projects, in an area of Hopewell known as Davisville. The children attended segregated all-Black Carnegie Woodson School. And while in Hopewell, Nellie engaged in several civic activities, such as the Civil Defense Ground Observer Corps, the GOC, and the school's PTA, and briefly even served as den mother for her son's Cub Scout unit. In the summer of 1957, the family moved into a newly built home in Ettrick near Virginia State College, and the children continued to attend segregated all-Black schools: Matoka Laboratory Elementary on the campus of Virginia State College, Union Grove, then Peabody High School in Petersburg, Virginia. When the youngest daughters, Sheila and Yolanda, reached the 3rd and 4th grade at Matoka Laboratory, Nellie had had enough of racially segregated schools. So that fall 1961, she walked alone into all-white Ettrick Elementary School and attempted to enroll her daughters there. Unsuccessful in this attempt and several other attempts, finally on February 28, 1962, Nellie and Bill McLeod filed a lawsuit along with about a dozen other neighbor African-American parents to integrate Chesterfield, Virginia schools. On November 17, 1962, the suit entitled Sheila Jane McLeod et al. Versus County School Board of Chesterfield County, Virginia et al. Prevailed for 2 of the litigants, Reuben Darrell Pierce and James Nimrod Brewer. The court also demanded that Chesterfield County devise a plan within 90 days to fully integrate the school system. So in the fall of 1963, Chesterfield County schools opened under court-ordered full integration. In addition to leading the fight to integrate Chesterfield schools, Nellie was a member of the Petersburg Improvement Association, PIA. She, along with her children, Priscilla and Charles, marched, picketed the city library, courthouse, and bus station, and they participated in sit-ins at department store lunch counters. During her time as an activist, she met many of the heroes of the civil rights movement, including Reverends Martin Luther King Jr., Fred Shuttlesworth, Y.T. Walker, Milton Reed, David Abernathy, and Curtis Harris. She also worked closely with Dorothy Cotton and Herbert Colton of Petersburg, Virginia. Nellie became the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference's director for the Northeast region of the United States under Dr. Martin Luther King. During this time, she was responsible for the rehiring of people who had been unjustly fired from their jobs. And she was responsible for the release of those wrongfully imprisoned, including Corporal Lindsay Scott. After the family moved to Northern Virginia, Nellie helped integrate the Prince William County government workforce, and she wrote to local newspapers to publicize and address issues of inequities. Further, she led countless voter registration drives and was a delegate to several national Democratic conventions, including those held in Chicago, San Francisco, and Miami. Throughout her lifetime, Nellie received numerous awards, including the Prince William NAACP Award for Community Services and Civil Rights, the Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Martin Luther King Jr. Award, and the Dale City Multicultural Achievement Award for Lifetime Courage. Ultimately, Nellie was honored for her life's work by Virginia Congressman Jerry Connolly, who had her civil rights story entered into the United States Library of Congress on July 2nd, 2014. Although she spent many years fighting for the rights of African Americans, Nellie McLeod was also an amazing wife and mother who enjoyed life. She was an expert seamstress, gardener, and cook. She was a licensed cosmetologist and often volunteered at Central State Hospital in Petersburg. She was an interior decorator and avid reader. For years, she was a member of Good Shepherd United Church in Dale City and later First Mount Zion Baptist Church in Dumfries, Virginia. The adage she lived her life by was, "If I can help somebody as I travel along, then my living shall not be in vain." On the occasion of her passing, October 29, 2017, our family received many letters of condolences and tributes from civic political leaders throughout the state of Virginia, including then Governor Terry McAuliffe. Perhaps, however, the most poignant tribute we received was a letter from then Chesterfield School Superintendent James Lane and a proclamation from the Chesterfield School Board acknowledging her life's work, specifically her efforts to integrate Chesterfield County schools. In his letter, Superintendent Lane stated, "She changed the course of history in Chesterfield County by walking into an all-white elementary school and demanding her children be enrolled, and ultimately filing suit to see that African-American children were served in the same way as white students. Today, as a result of her actions, our school division is focused on providing equitable experiences for all students." Now, I will share with you some of the personal experiences and talk a little bit about my mother, not as a civil rights leader, but as a mother, and the influence that she had on me. And her influence on me actually started quite early in life. I remember when we were in the projects, walking to the school one morning, first grade, she asked what I wanted to be when I grew up. My response, apparently didn't suit her. I said, "I want to be in the Navy, like my father had been." And she leaned into me and made it real clear that, and her words were, in fact, "You don't have to be what your father was. You can be anything that you want to be." And so began my journey for excellence and equity. Also in the first grade, I remember when the Brown versus Board of Education decision came down in 1954. My mother was elated, and she was almost in tears of joy. And I asked why she was so happy. She said, "Well, son, this means that you won't have to go to segregated schools any longer." Little did she know that with the work of the massive resistance movement, I would go to segregated schools for another 9 years before I went to an integrated school, and only then because of the lawsuit that they filed. On our trip to Texas, back home, to show you again the grit of my mother. As we drove through these little southern towns, and again, remember this was before the advent of the highway system. So we drove through seemed like a million little towns to get from Hopewell and Petersburg to Texas. But everywhere we would stop, she would also inquire among the Black people who lived there what life was like for them. And I do remember this one time at a service station, she asked the Black fellow who was pumping the gas, how life was like, what life was like for him in his town. And I remember his response. He said, "Oh man, things are real good here. The white people treat us real well. But now the town down the road, don't stop there because they're real ugly to colored people." So she said, "Well, great, at least things are going well for you here." She said, "Well, where's your restroom?" And he pointed to the side of the building. And she went around to the side and there was no restroom. So she came back and protested, "I didn't see a restroom." And he said, "Oh, no, ma'am, we don't have a restroom for colored. You have to do your business over there on the side in the woods. I'll stand guard and make sure nobody comes down there to bother you." And at that, she said, "Well, stop right there. Don't pump 1 more ounce of gas in that car. I'm not paying for gas at a service station that doesn't even have a restroom for Black people." And with that, the owner of the service station came out with his grease rag in his hand and chomping on a cigar, saying, "What's wrong, Willie?" And he said, "Oh, the lady don't want to pay for the gas." And he turned the service station owner turned to my mother and said, "What's wrong with you, woman?" And she said, "That's right, I'm not paying for gas at a place that doesn't even have a restroom for Black people." So he said, "You'll pay for the gas or I'll call the sheriff and have you locked up." And her response was, "Well, call the sheriff, lock us up, lock me up, lock all of us up." And with that, I must confess, I said, "All of us, mother?" I can recall one time I was falsely accused of shoplifting, racially profiling a little department store in Petersburg, Virginia. And that's when she really sprang into action. When confronted with racism, or injustice, my mother came alive. And what had happened, we were at a department store shopping, and I had been followed around, and they suggested that I was shoplifting. And so they brought me to the front of the store. And with that, she interjected, "Well, did you steal those ties, Lionel?" Which is what she called me. I said, "No, ma'am, no, mother, I didn't steal the ties." She said, "Well, pull your pockets out." So I pulled my pockets out. She said, "Well, now pull your shirt up." I pulled my shirt up. Later, she admitted to me her heart was racing, hoping that those ties would fall out of my pockets, out of my shirt. But so at this point, the manager of the department store saw that they'd made a huge mistake. They're running into Nellie McLeod. So he tried to usher us into his office to resolve the situation, but she said, "No, we can have it out right here where there are witnesses." And she went up and down the line, getting names of people who agreed to be witness to that incident. And she taught me later to say that when things happen to you, don't get mad, get even. After we filed a lawsuit to integrate the schools, we came home from school, my mother had a visit before the lawsuit was adjudicated. And she said 2 men had come to the home inquiring if she was Nellie McLeod. And she said, "Depends on who wants to know." They then said, "Well, we have some," they then flashed their badges to show that they were with the local police department and said, "We have some bad news for you, ma'am, but we don't want to give it to you if you're here by yourself." So she then said, "Well, what is it? Did something happen to one of my children at school?" And the man said, "No." He said, "Well, did something happen to my husband on his job?" They said, "No." And so her response was, "Well, if nothing happened to my kids or to my husband, I can take whatever it is you have to say." And they then went on to share with her that they had 2 informants from the local Ku Klux Klan, and that they were planning to burn a cross in our yard for having had the temerity to file a lawsuit to integrate the school. At that point, she dropped to her knees and raised her hand and said, "Thank you, Jesus." And she said that those white men probably felt like this Black woman had lost her mind. She said, "Thank you, Jesus." She said, I thought you came to bring me some bad news. She said, I don't care 2 cents about the NAA, about the sorry, Ku Klux Klan. I thought you was gonna tell me something that happened to my kids. Tell them if they're gonna bring the, if they're gonna burn the cross, make sure they don't burn them near my roses because I just planted them. Well, after the suit was adjudicated and the schools were integrated, one day Nellie came up to the school, and later that night she told me, she asked me, why were all the Black kids sitting on the one side of the cafeteria? And I said, Mother, they're sitting over there because that's where we want to sit. She then said these words. She said, we didn't fight to integrate this school for you guys to go in there and resegregate. So the next day we had a meeting on the bus, all the Black kids on one bus, and we had an organizational meeting. And I said to each of them, tomorrow bring your lunch to school and sit one to a table. And so that was our first demonstration at the all-white, at Montauk High School. And they sat one to a table. When the white kids came in, many of them refused to sit down. But we made the point known at that point, we were there and we weren't there to be resegregated. As a result of my mother's courage, I found my own courage. And so a lot of the things that I was able to accomplish, and I was the first in a number of areas, were due to her grit. I was a captain of the basketball team at Montauk High School. I was the first Black player on the RPI VCU basketball team. I started the Black Student Organization at VCU. I led the Black Student Protest Movement at VCU. Even when I was told by a dean that I'd never graduate from VCU, the next year I graduated. And 2 years later, I had my master's degree. My mother taught me anything that was don't quit. I was the first Black admissions recruit at VCU. I worked at the State Department to facilitate integration around the state. The point is, a lot of my efforts and my achievements were due primarily to my mother's involvement and to her encouragement of me. Probably the smartest thing I ever did was to marry Beatrice Fisher McLeod, a two-time Hampton University grad at Delta and a former cheerleader from White Plains, nearby White Plains, New York. Bea became the director of school counseling, and she was the president of Virginia School Counseling Association. Together, we raised 2 boys, both Harvard-educated, Harvard graduate, and both successful in their careers. The prevailing thought that we tried to keep them aware of was the notion that I had been made aware of, which was to excel, to do all that you can, and take advantage of every opportunity that you have. There are several quotes that I can attribute to my mother that really inspired me. She would say, don't be afraid to be first. Don't be uncomfortable being the only one. And don't pay people to insult or disrespect you, because there's too many people willing to do that free. The quotes that she most remembered Dr. King from were these: if a man hasn't found something he isn't willing to die for, he's not fit to live. She also said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If my mother were alive today, she would agree with the tenet, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. In the midst of all her civil rights efforts, my mother found the time to fulfill another lifelong ambition, and that was to graduate from high school. So on February the 4th, 1975, at the age of 49, my mother earned her GED certificate from the state of Virginia. My mother saw her role as a parent to not only raise us, but to also train us to recognize racism, injustice, and to stand up and speak out against them. Or in John Lewis's words, you see something, say something. We were not just her children, we were her foot soldiers. Given her deep and abiding commitment to social justice, freedom, and equality, my mother's life work, particularly in voter registration, was rewarded with the 2011 election of Barack Hussein Obama II as the 44th president of the United States. And that I conclude with the following. Whenever I see a strong, courageous woman, particularly a strong woman of color, I think of my mother, Nellie Jane Hinderman McLeod. She was a Harriet Tubman, of my life. And much of my success in life and the success of my children, I owe to the little Black girl from Southeast Texas who never forgot where she came from or who came before her. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. McLeod. Wonderful tribute to the mom. So many lessons that we can all use. Quite a profound presentation. We have a few questions that have come in. As you can see, everyone in the chat is giving you praise and claps. Okay. We have a question for Jackson Cantrell. This person wants to know, are you writing a book on this topic?
I don't believe I will be writing a book. I do have 2 reports published with the state of Louisiana that I published in the aftermath of the Eagle Scout project, just so more people could learn about this. It's also on file with the Amistad Research Center in New Orleans.
Awesome. That was my next question in terms of where your work is housed. They also want to know, have you done any genealogical work or identified any descendants from Fontainebleau?
Yes, I managed to identify one descendant from Fontainebleau.
Okay. This question is for Mr. McLeod. I wanted to know, in terms of, in what ways, because you've been in education for quite some time, in what ways have you encouraged the young people who work with to document their family stories in the ways that you have done with your tribute to your mom?
Well, one of the things is to talk to your parents and get them to open up about their personal past and some of the things that they've gone through. You know, a lot of, unfortunately, as parents, we don't like to share a lot of the trouble spots or the low spots in our lives, but you'd be surprised how encouraging youngsters find that. I think one of the unfortunate breaks in the chain is that we fail to teach our children their past or to teach them, you know, who came before them. And so it's difficult for a lot of our kids, particularly those who don't know their background or don't know their history or don't know their personal family's history. You know, a lot of times kids will know more about the history of Martin Luther King than they know about their own grandfather. So I think it's important that parents understand the wisdom that's inherent in keeping their kids, you know, connected with their own personal past, as well as the past of famous Black people.
That's phenomenal. Also, is most of the knowledge of your mother's story from oral history? And I know you have your own personal understanding of it, but also have you done any outside or additional research on her life? Well,
much of her life is chronicled, as I said before, is in the Library of Congress. You'll see newspaper articles in the Washington Post and the say the Richmond Times-Dispatch, Chesterfield Observer, the northern newspapers in Northern Virginia have done an excellent job on chronicling her. I have a cousin, Dr. Paula Kauscher, who I would consider to be our depository of information about my mother and the whole Hinderman family. She even points to our great aunt, Ms. K, who I think her name was, cannot think of her first name, but anyway, her last name was K, and she was also very big in education, and she believes that my mother got her inspiration from that. I often ask from various folk why my mother became so I guess the best thing I can say is dedicated to the notion of justice and so averse to injustice. And someone showed me about an incident, a situation where she went out to pick cotton. And they had, this is in the 30s, of course, and she was averse to doing that, and they finally talked her into it. She went out there one day, she finally succumbed and went out to pick cotton one day. And she said she was so sore and so tired at the end of the day. It pretty much convinced her that wasn't something she wanted to do, even for spending change. But on the other hand, what it really, even though she never went back to that field, she never forgot how sore and how tired she was. And it caused her to wonder or to reflect on our ancestors, her ancestors who had actually had to go and didn't have the option not to go again, and how they must have labored under that hot South Texas sun, boiling and baking, if you will, for no pay, not low pay, but no pay. And I think that's what really inspired her.
Absolutely. Jackson, we have another question for you. Could you tell us more about how you got involved with this project?
Yes. So I had met a gentleman by the name of Greyhawk Perkins. He was a park ranger at Fontainebleau State Park, and I met him when I was about 6 years old. My family has always been out of doors, and one day he talked to me, and we were bouncing off of each other, asking about history, and him telling me he was doing more of the telling because, you know, I was a 6-year-old and didn't know too much. But he had at one point asked me, son, what do you think that Alley of Oaks was for? And I asked, well, I mean, people have seen Django Unchained or Gone with the Wind, and most people think of that Alley of Oaks as being sort of the, I guess, driveway to a large plantation home. And that's what I said. Was it a large plantation house? And he said, no, that's where the enslaved people were, or that's where the cabins were, excuse me. And that sort of intrigued me. And I mean, it's a beautiful location, and there wasn't very much information available to the public about exactly what had gone on at Fontainebleau. Most people knew that at one point it had been a sugar plantation, but the Alley of Oaks, most people didn't realize that that's where the enslaved cabins were. People would go out to have weddings and to take family photos and everything like that. And that I always felt disappointed that people didn't know the story behind everything that had happened. And I didn't want them to not do all of that stuff. I mean, people should enjoy the land and the state park, but I just felt like people should be more reverent and more understanding of what had happened. So when it came time for me to do my Eagle project, I decided that that's what I was going to do. And I put 2 historical markers up, one for the native people of Fontainebleau and one for the enslaved people as well.
Great, thank you so much for that. And this is a comment for Dr. McLeod from Margaret Bristow. Is one to know, are you aware of the teachers in the movement done by UVA, which teachers are interviewed sharing their memories of the impact of the civil rights on their teaching? She thinks you would be an excellent candidate for an interview.
Well, just reach out to me through the pod here, through the this group, and I'm happy to whatever I can do to assist you in that area or that regard.
So feel free to send them a private message with your email address. Also, someone wants to know what your sons are currently doing, and are they involved in any civil rights movement issues in the law?
Well, my kids, I'm sorry, coming along, my kids, of course, much of the fight that we had, they didn't have to deal with, but they were both outstanding and involved in student activities in the school and at Harvard. One is now, in fact, an attorney with a pretty prestigious firm, and he's about to be on loan to the NAACP Legal Defense Fund for the next 6 months. And the other is working with in the corporate firm, and he's doing his thing within that firm.
So they are keeping the family tradition of excellence going.
Absolutely.
And we have one last question for you, Jackson. You mentioned several hearth features or structures that were revealed during the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. Were there any efforts to preserve these features, or were they destroyed?
These features are still at the park. If you kick up some of the loose topsoil underneath the Alley of Oaks, you can still see the bricks. The reason why they were destroyed was because in the 1930s, they were knocked down so that the park could mow the grass better, and they were filled in. So they are preserved in the fact that they're underneath the oak trees. There's no real way that they could be taken out of the ground without damaging the oaks. They're very old, obviously. So it's just preserved by just being there.
Thank you so much for that. And there was another comment to you, Dr. McLeod, stating that they've learned so many amazing, so much about the amazing leaders from Petersburg, and wonder if you believe that children are as accomplished. Okay, we'll scratch that bar, but but in terms of Jackson, there's another question for you. Is well, they want to know if the presentations will be available for future viewing, and they will be available on YouTube. You can access them later, and we will send out a notification via email announcing the availability of these videos of all of these wonderful panels. Once again, let's give these gentlemen a hand, virtual applause. Thank you all so very much. As you see, this symposium gets better by the day. So definitely stay tuned for the rest of the week. Drop in when you can. We look forward to seeing you later this week. We have some wonderful presentations lined up. Also, we have on Thursday a coffee break. So feel free to drop in and just to visit with us. And again, thank you both for these phenomenal presentations, and thanks to the audience for joining us for this evening's event.